Victor Langston leaned back in his leather seat, sipping champagne as the engines hummed beneath him. Surrounded by his wealthy friends, the billionaire wore his arrogance like another tailored suit. He pointed at the flight attendant, Grace Miller, and smirked. "Land this plane and it's yours," he joked, laughter erupting around him. To them, it was entertainment, a cruel tease at the expense of the quiet woman pouring their drinks. Grace smiled politely, though her cheeks burned with humiliation. They didn't know the truth, that every button, every dial in that cockpit was already etched in her memory. She had once dreamed of sitting in the captain's seat, until life's hardships grounded her. But fate had a different plan for today. When arrogance met necessity, and the people who mocked her most found themselves desperate for survival, Grace would rise from the aisle to the cockpit. And the very jet that symbolized their wealth would become the stage for her triumph. Because the woman they dismissed as just a flight attendant was about to do the impossible and claim the skies as her own. The champagne still bubbled in crystal glasses as Victor Langston's entourage reveled in their own importance. Laughter filled the cabin, bouncing off polished wood and soft leather. Grace Miller stood quietly, offering refills with practiced grace, her posture straight, her voice calm. She had spent years in this role, learning to smile at arrogance, to keep her composure when passengers treated her like furniture. But today's cruelty stung deeper. "Come on, Grace," Victor chuckled, his words soaked in condescension. "Imagine yourself up there, hands on the controls. You'd crash us all before we touched the ground." The men roared with laughter, one of them raising his glass in a mock toast to her. "To our brave Captain Grace. The shortest flight in history." Grace's smile never wavered, but her knuckles whitened around the serving tray. She wasn't surprised, they had made jokes at her expense before. Yet something about the way they dismissed her so openly, so thoughtlessly, cut at the part of her that had once dared to dream bigger. The cabin blurred for a moment as memory pulled her back. She remembered the first time she sat in a cockpit, years ago, a student pilot filled with nerves and awe. The dials, the yoke, the endless stretch of sky, it had felt like home. But her father's illness, the crushing bills, the need to keep her family afloat had forced her to leave that dream behind. Flight school faded into memory, replaced by long shifts, pressed uniforms, and passengers who never looked her in the eye. And yet, she never stopped studying. Manuals, simulations, conversations stolen with kind captains on layovers, her knowledge had only grown sharper in silence. She carried it like a secret flame, hidden but unextinguished. Victor's companion, a slick-haired executive named Brandon, leaned forward. "You know, Victor, maybe she should try. A little thrill ride for the rest of us. I bet she doesn't even know how to buckle the captain's seatbelt." More laughter exploded. Brandon reached out and tugged lightly at Grace's sleeve as if to emphasize her role. "Careful, sweetheart. Don't spill the drinks before you crash the jet." Her cheeks flushed, but she stayed silent. She had learned long ago that answering back only fueled their ridicule. Instead, she focused on her breathing, keeping her voice steady as she asked, "Would anyone like more champagne?" "Perfect," Victor said, ignoring her question entirely. He stood, wobbling slightly with drink, and raised his glass. "Gentlemen, I propose a wager. If Grace here can even start the engines without setting off alarms, I'll buy her a car. But if she fails, as we all know she will, she serves us barefoot the rest of the flight." The men howled at the image, some pounding their fists on the table between the seats. Grace felt her stomach tighten. She had endured countless humiliations, but this was different. They weren't just mocking her, they were challenging her humanity, stripping her down to an object for their entertainment. "Victor, please," one of the women in the group said, though her tone was more amused than concerned. "Don't break the poor girl. She's only here to serve drinks." Grace lowered her eyes. Humility was her shield, but each word struck like a stone. She could almost feel the walls of the plane closing in, her dreams pressing against her ribs, begging for release. She wanted to scream, to shout that she could fly this plane better than any of them could imagine. But she swallowed the fire. Victor clapped his hands, drawing attention back to himself. No, listen. I've got it. The ultimate challenge. Grace, land this plane. Do it, and it's yours. He laughed so hard his face turned red. Imagine a flight attendant owning a jet worth more than she'll make in 10 lifetimes. The entourage erupted into applause, their cruel delight echoing louder than the engines. To them, it was all a joke. But Grace felt the weight of the words settle into her bones. A cruel wager, yes, but also an opportunity. For the first time, the door between her and the life she once dreamed of wasn't locked. It was open, even if only slightly. She turned to look toward the cockpit door. Through the small glass window, she saw the faint outlines of instruments glowing in the dark. She knew them as well as she knew her own reflection. Victor's laughter faded into background noise as a thought crystallized in her mind. What if this was her moment? But before she could consider it further, Brandon's voice cut through. Don't tell me you're actually thinking about it, Grace. You'll kill us all before we even line up with a runway. His smirk widened, certain she would retreat into silence. Victor leaned closer, his eyes glittering with intoxicated amusement. Go on, Grace. Prove us wrong. Or prove us right. Either way, it'll be a show. The group cheered, egging her on, treating her dignity like a gambling chip in their game. Grace stood frozen for a heartbeat, tray in hand, heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment when dreams collided with ridicule, when humiliation demanded either submission or defiance. And as turbulence rattled the cabin, almost on cue, the challenge no longer seemed hypothetical. The captain's voice crackled faintly over the intercom, strained and uncertain, before cutting off mid-sentence. Gasps filled the jet as passengers glanced nervously toward the cockpit. The laughter faltered. Victor frowned, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. What's going on up there? Grace felt the air change. She knew something was wrong. The pilots were in trouble. And suddenly, the cruel joke of moments ago transformed into a desperate, real possibility. The impossible challenge had just become terrifyingly real. Right now, Grace is standing on the edge of the impossible, mocked, challenged, and with the lives of everyone on board suddenly in her hands. And that's exactly why stories like this matter. They remind us that the underestimated can become the unstoppable when the moment arrives. If you're feeling the tension build and you want to see how Grace turns this humiliation into triumph, make sure you subscribe right now. Don't miss the moment she proves every doubter wrong. And while you're here, drop a comment. Have you ever been underestimated, only to surprise everyone? Share your story, we might feature it next. The cabin was no longer filled with laughter. Instead, uneasy murmurs and darting glances replaced the smug confidence of moments before. The intercom had gone silent, and the slight but persistent tremor of turbulence kept rattling glasses on the tables. Grace set her tray down carefully, her heart pounding as if it already knew the decision she was about to make. Victor Langston's smirk had faded into a tight line. He pressed the button to call the cockpit, but no one answered. Brandon shifted in his seat, his earlier arrogance replaced by flickers of worry. What's taking so long up there? He muttered, half to himself. Grace stood tall, smoothing her uniform with steady hands. I should check on the pilots, she said softly. Her voice carried more authority than anyone expected. Without waiting for permission, she moved toward the cockpit door. The group exchanged skeptical looks, but no one stopped her. Perhaps for the first time, they sensed that their safety might rest in the hands they had just ridiculed. Inside the cockpit, the scene was worse than she feared. The captain slumped unconscious against his seat, and the co-pilot struggled weakly, his face pale, his breathing shallow. Oxygen masks dangled above them. A medical emergency had taken both men out of commission. The plane flew on autopilot, but not for long. Fuel was finite, and storms loomed ahead on the radar. Grace's pulse surged, but training long buried awoke like muscle memory. She pulled the co-pilot's mask securely over his face, checked the captain's pulse, then slid into the left seat. The familiar sight of the controls, the glow of instruments, felt like stepping back into the life she once dreamed of. Her fingers traced over the yoke, switches, and levers with reverence and certainty. When she re-emerged for a moment, the cabin erupted with questions. What happened? Victor demanded, his voice higher than before. Grace met his gaze evenly. Both pilots are incapacitated. I'm taking control. The room fell silent. Brandon let out a disbelieving laugh. You? Don't be ridiculous. You serve drinks, you don't land jets. Grace didn't flinch. You can stay here and argue, or you can sit down, buckle up, and let me work. Your choice. Something in her tone silenced him. Slowly, passengers fastened their belts, fear settling them more effectively than any luxury could. Grace shut the cockpit door behind her, slipping on the headset. She tuned the radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. Mayday, Mayday, this is Langston Gulfstream 5, declaring an emergency. Both pilots incapacitated. Flight attendant at controls. A crackle, then a calm voice replied, Gulfstream 5, this is air traffic control. Copy your emergency. Identify yourself. Grace drew a breath. My name is Grace Miller. I have partial flight training. Requesting immediate vectors for emergency landing. There was a pause, then the controller's voice grew firmer, respectful. Copy that, Grace. We're with you. You're not alone. Those words steadied her more than anything. She rolled the yoke gently, adjusting the course as instructed. Her mind shifted into focus, the years of study, the hours of practice, the countless silent rehearsals in her head all coalescing into this moment. She was no longer just a flight attendant. She was the pilot now. Behind her, the passengers sat frozen, listening to every word over the cabin speakers. Victor gripped his armrest, sweat glistening on his forehead. His earlier challenge, land this plane and it's yours, echoed back at him, no longer a joke but a looming reality. The descent began. Storm clouds brewed outside the windows, lightning flashing in the distance. Grace's hand stayed steady on the controls, her voice calm as she repeated instructions back to ATC. Step by step, she executed the approach. Every correction, every adjustment, every word carried the weight of lives depending on her. Grace, you're lined up with the runway, the controller's voice came through. Winds are gusting, but you're stable. You've got this. The runway lights glimmered ahead like a lifeline. Grace adjusted flaps, reduced thrust, and steadied the nose. The plane shook as turbulence hit, passengers gasping, but she held firm. Her jaw set, her eyes locked forward, she guided the massive jet toward Earth. Inside the cabin, silence reigned. The same people who had laughed at her now clung to their seats, eyes wide, watching the woman they had mocked command their fate with unshakable poise. Even Victor, the billionaire who owned everything but humility, could only stare in awe. The wheels screeched as rubber kissed asphalt. The plane jolted, bounced once, then steadied. Grace applied the brakes, guiding the jet down the runway, slowing until at last it rolled to a stop. For a moment, there was only the hiss of engines winding down. Then the cabin erupted. Cheers, sobs, applause, it was a symphony of relief and disbelief. Passengers unbuckled, some crying openly, others staring at Grace through the cockpit glass as if seeing her for the first time. Victor stood shakily, his face pale, his arrogance dissolved. His words came out barely audible, she did it. The door opened, and Grace stepped back into the cabin. Her uniform was the same, her expression calm, but her presence radiated power. The woman they had dismissed as invisible had just performed the impossible. And in that silence before the cheering began again, one truth settled over them all. Grace Miller had not just landed the plane. She had claimed the sky, and rewritten the limits of who they believed she could be. The cabin of the Gulfstream was a different world than it had been an hour ago. Where laughter and arrogance once reigned, there was now awe, and silence thick enough to hear hearts still racing. Grace Miller stood just outside the cockpit, her hands calm at her sides though her pulse still thundered in her ears. The impossible had been done. The plane was safely on the ground. And everyone knew exactly who had done it. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, a smattering of applause began. It grew, rolling like a wave down the aisle until the entire cabin erupted into cheers. Some passengers cried openly, others shouted her name, and a few simply looked at her with stunned reverence, as though they were seeing her for the first time. Victor Langston, the billionaire who had mocked her so cruelly, pushed himself to his feet. His face was pale, his composure fractured. He opened his mouth, searching for words, but the sound caught in his throat. The man who had once laughed at her dreams could now only stand in front of her, humbled and exposed. Grace did not gloat. She simply nodded at him, her expression composed, her eyes steady. The silence between them said everything. Brandon, the slick-haired executive who had been loudest in mocking her, now avoided her gaze entirely. His earlier smirk was gone, replaced with a shame he couldn't mask. He sank back into his seat, fumbling with his glass as though he could disappear into it. Grace felt no satisfaction in his discomfort, only a quiet sense of justice. Words had power, and today, his words had crumbled under the weight of reality. One by one, the consequences for the entourage became clear. The women who had laughed at her earlier now whispered to each other, their eyes flicking to Grace with something like guilt. A man who had jeered the loudest shook his head, muttering, "Unbelievable," not at her ability, but at his own blindness. The hierarchy of the cabin had shifted entirely. The pedestal they once stood on had collapsed, leaving Grace as the one who held true strength. An air traffic official boarded soon after, rushing forward to check on the incapacitated pilots. The professionals moved with urgency, but their eyes kept darting back to Grace with respect. One of them, a veteran with gray streaks in his hair, paused and offered his hand. "What you did, it was extraordinary. Not just anyone could have held it together like that." His voice carried the weight of experience, and in that recognition, Grace felt something she had long been denied: validation. Victor finally found his voice. He cleared his throat, his tone stripped of bravado. "Grace," he said quietly, "I made a promise. Land this plane, and it's yours." His entourage shifted uncomfortably, realizing the joke had turned into a binding vow. All eyes turned to Grace, waiting for her answer. But Grace only smiled gently, shaking her head. "I don't need your plane, Mr. Langston. I only need my dignity, and I think I've reclaimed it." The words hit harder than any demand for ownership ever could. Victor's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly. For perhaps the first time in his life, he looked at another person not through the lens of wealth or status, but through respect. Grace had taught them all, that some victories can't be bought. The group dispersed eventually, each humbled in their own way. Brandon avoided everyone's eyes as he left, his bravado shattered. The women offered hushed apologies. Victor walked slower than before, the weight of his arrogance heavy on his shoulders. Justice had been served, not through revenge, but through the quiet triumph of truth. As the chaos settled, Grace stepped off the jet and onto the tarmac. The cool night air wrapped around her, carrying with it the faint roar of other aircraft in the distance. She breathed deeply, the sky above vast and endless. For the first time in years, she felt not the ache of a lost dream, but the certainty of a new beginning. She walked away without looking back. She did not crave their applause, nor their approval. Her worth had never been measured by the glasses she filled or the jokes she endured. It had always been in the quiet resilience she carried, and the knowledge she nurtured when no one else believed in her. That night, Grace returned to her modest apartment. She hung her uniform neatly, as she always did, and sat by the window with a notebook. The city lights glittered below, but her eyes looked higher, toward the stars she had once thought unreachable. She began to write again, notes, calculations, plans. Not for others, but for herself. She had proven to the world what she already knew: she was capable of more. And now, she would decide what came next. The world might still see her as a flight attendant. But Grace Miller knew better. She was a pilot at heart, a woman who had claimed the sky in the face of doubt and arrogance. And no billionaire's jest or entourage's laughter could ever take that away again. Because true victory isn't about owning a jet. It's about owning yourself. And that, Grace had done completely. Grace's story reminds us that respect isn't given, it's earned through courage, resilience, and staying true to who we are. She was mocked, underestimated, and dismissed, yet when the moment came, she proved that quiet strength can rise higher than arrogance ever will. And here's the truth, every one of us has a Grace moment waiting. A chance to surprise the world, and maybe even ourselves. Now it's your turn. What did you take from Grace's journey? Share your thoughts in the comments below, we want to hear your voice. Let's build a community that celebrates the underdogs, the dreamers, and the fighters who don't give up. And of course, don't forget to subscribe, because more stories like this are coming your way. Stories that remind you that your triumph could be closer than you think.